Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to begin by focusing on Schedule 1, which is around the role of enforcement officers and honorary enforcement officers under this new Game Animal Council legislation. Because any piece of legislation is only as good as in terms of how well it can be enforced. And so the enforcement and the penalty provisions that are found in Part 2 of this bill will only really have any meaning or any effect if those people who seek to break the law in terms of this Game Animal Council feel that there's an adequate chance that they will be caught in breaching the provisions of this bill. And one of the concerns that we had at Select Committee was really a lack of detail around how many of these enforcement officers we would have. We know that every constable in the New Zealand Police Force will be considered an enforcement officer, but we also know that they have a very large job to do outside of the Game Animal Council bill. The reality is I don't believe that our police force are going to be patrolling dockland as a priority to catch people carrying out illegal hunting or illegal hunting of herds of national significance, unless they've been tipped off that there's something very bad going on. But then the question comes down to who is going to do that day-to-day monitoring that realistically is not going to be carried out by the New Zealand Police Force. And so we have a role of enforcement officers, and then we have what are called honorary enforcement officers. And at Select Committee, our concern was very much that this not become the dad's army of the conservation estate, that these be very real positions that bring in people who have the right qualifications and experience and knowledge, particularly in the areas of health and safety. Hunting is obviously a very dangerous activity, and the last thing we would want to do is put people who are inadequately trained in harm's way by sending them out into a part of the conservation estate where hunting is being carried out. And it comes down to really in Schedule 1, Clause 2.1, which says the Director General may appoint any fit and proper person who is suitably qualified and trained, but nowhere in the legislation do we find out what suitably qualified and trained is deemed to be. There are no thresholds set, there are no basic competencies put in place, and so, you know, I mean, I'd like to think the Director General is going to do the right thing, but as we can see, public servants can be made to do things that they don't particularly want to do, that are against the interests of the Department of Conservation and what we would normally expect from the Department of Conservation. And so if we found out, that's right, it's been going on for 5 years, and if we were then to find out that there was the government were under some pressure because, in fact, these are honorary positions. The Minister has the ability to reimburse for realistic costs, but they're not getting paid. And so I question, really, how realistic it is to think that we're going to get a big enough force of these people to be able to monitor these activities, given that the people who are paid to do it, the paid enforcement officers, are the police force, and this is not going to be a priority for them. That definition of suitably qualified and trained there's a risk it's watered down without adequate belts and braces in this schedule, in this part of the bill, to say what the core competencies are, that if the government feels under pressure that they don't have enough people out there, that they start to actually water down that definition of suitably qualified and trained, and then we end up with people carrying out this very important role. And I want to just briefly go through some of the powers that these honorary enforcement officers will have. They basically have all the powers that a police officer would have in the Department of Conservation. The power to intervene to prevent or stop offending, the power to require personal details or production of lawful authority, the power to search. They will have, the honorary enforcement officers may, without a warrant, search any building, vehicle, vessel, aircraft, animal or other thing on public conservation land if they believe it's in the possession of or under the control of someone who they think is committing an offence under this Act. I mean, that's the power to stop, the powers of seizure. These are quite significant powers to be handing over to non-professional people, and all we were asking was really that we have a little bit more detail in this part of the bill about the basic core competencies and requirements of an honorary enforcement officer, given that they're basically going to have nearly all the powers of a police officer when they're acting on Department of Conservation land. And Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member Paul Goldsmith.
I move that the question be now put.
Mr.
No,
Chair.
I intend to call Moana Maki.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And so, coming back to my point after that brief and very good speech from Mr. Goldsmith.
What a contribution.
It's yeah, okay. It's this definition of suitably qualified and trained, and it's a Director General who will be appointing these people and making these judgments. But as we know, Director Generals in the Department of Conservation can be leaned on to do things that they're not particularly comfortable with. We know that that's the case, particularly in terms of the Ruataniwha Dam scheme, currently before a board of inquiry. And I'm sorry, Ms Collins, but where there's smoke, there's fire. And I don't think there's anyone who's under any illusion that the Department of Conservation was weighed on very heavily to pull their submission on the Ruataniwha Dam scheme. That's quite clear. The Minister leaned on the Department of Conservation, and this happens from time to time. So that's why we're asking in this piece of legislation that we have ministers in the national government who are prepared to lean on their Director Generals and their public servants and get them to do things that they don't want to do. That's why it's important in legislation like this that when we're giving people the power of a police officer, that's right, a staff member actually did resign over what happened in the Department of Conservation with Ruataniwha, so it does happen, it has happened, it is happening. And that's why when we're giving these honorary enforcement officers basically the role of a police officer in the conservation estate, and it's a Director General who is determining who is suitably qualified and trained, we should have a little bit more in legislation to make it clear that when we can't find enough of these people because they're not paid positions, they're voluntary positions, when suddenly there isn't that the numbers that were promised in the conservation estate, that the Minister doesn't then lean on the Director General to say, well, we just need to water down those kind of standards you've put in place for what these people, well, it would be good to have some basic core competencies around that as well. So when you look at the extensive powers, we're very disappointed that we weren't able to get that under Schedule 1 of this particular Act. Now, one of the good things in Part 2 of the Act is Clause 35, which is a review of the operation of the Act, which means that in 3 years' time, when we're the government, we'll get to see whether or not this Act has actually met its intentions, where the gaps are, and we will pledge to carry out a proper review of the Act. We believe that this was a lost opportunity, that there are real synergies and real common goals that could have been built on between recreational hunters, or all hunters now. This bill was just about recreational hunters, it's now about all hunters, which changes the flavour of it significantly. But to see how the Act has operated in practice, whether the many concerns that Treasury and the Department of Conservation, the many concerns that officials right across the board raised during the development of this policy in the Select Committee process, whether or not those concerns have been realised, and if they have been realised, what then we can do about it. And we do pledge to carry out a very thorough and transparent review of this Act in 3 years' time. It's a shame that it doesn't say, it would actually be good to have an element of independence perhaps in that review. The review of the operation of the Act as it is in the bill is that the Minister will do that, and as we know, this is a government that's not afraid to put out reviews which don't reflect reality but reflect what they want reality to be. And so it's a shame there's not a little bit more of independence in Clause 35 in relation to the review of the operation of the Act, just to give the public confidence that this isn't the government finding what they want to find, that there is a genuine, trying to brush away any criticisms or concerns that claims they made about how the way the Act would operate haven't actually come to pass. And I think in terms of the very significant change that we made in Part 1 of the bill, which was to basically remove the word recreational from the entire bill and now make this apply to all hunters, to see whether or not that change, which we're very concerned about because we think it actually shuts the recreational guys out. We wanted to make it very clear that even though these are small voluntary organisations, they're recreational, they're not professional, that these are the people that we really want to be involved in this process. We want them to be part of the engagement that the Department of Conservation has, and now there's no requirement to do that because there's no mention of the word recreational. And it's very telling that in that change that they made, which we will be reviewing under Clause 35 in Part 2 of this bill. Under that change they made, which never came to Select Committee, at Select Committee this was never raised with us as a problem. This is Minister Bridges' actually modus operandi, so it's quite fortuitous that he's in the chair at the moment. It never came to Select Committee. It was dropped in the House during the debate. It'll be very interesting to see what.
Call the honourable member.
Is someone else going?
Mr. Chair.
Mark Mitchell.
I move